So I'd like to welcome you back for the afternoon session. I must say, I've been at SCI since 2002. And so I think the label I was given is I'm the youngest, oldest member. So I joined as an assistant professor. I think I was the first of the assistant professors that joined at SCI. And I had the opportunity to be the interim director from 2016 to, or excuse me, 2018 to 2020, and then helped in terms of the transition to Manish. So I am a bridge between two very strong pillars, Chris Johnson and Manish Parashar, and I think that's been great for SCI. And as Manish said, what we want to do this afternoon, the panel now is concerning, in part, the exciting opportunity that is before SCI at the current time, which is concerning responsible AI. So as Manish mentioned, Manish and his leadership team within SCI will be leading a university effort. So our president of the university has committed $100 billion to responsible use of AI. And so we are calling it the Responsible AI Initiative. And so we have a collection of panelists, and we're going to talk about responsible AI from the perspective of different vantage points. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves, to spend a moment, and the point of their introduction is not to make a position statement, but to give you their context. And then I'll start off by asking questions. So we'll start with Margaret.
Thanks so much, Mike. It's great to be here. And I realized, I thought, oh, there's some red flowers. They match my suit. And then I realized I'm matching the University of Utah colors today. But I wouldn't have purposely done that because I have to confess that I am a BYU alum. So sorry about that. I'm Margaret Woolley Busse, and I am the executive director of the Utah Department of Commerce. So I work directly for Governor Cox, and the Utah Department of Commerce is really the main business regulator, amongst other things, that it does for the state of Utah. And the reason I think I'm here is that we, a task force of us over the last year, worked hard to figure out how Utah, from a policy standpoint, could get its arms around this new emerging and burgeoning technology of artificial intelligence. And so I know we'll be able to talk about that later, what we've done so far and what our approach is. But that's the context that I bring here today.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bill Anderegg. I'm a faculty member here at the U in the School of Biological Sciences. I'm a climate scientist by training, and I'm also the director of the Wilkes Center for Climate Science and Policy on campus. I've been involved in this responsible AI initiative, and there's an environment focal group, and as part of a number of faculty in that group, we're really trying to think through how can the University of Utah play a role in really developing sustainable AI, thinking about the impacts of AI on the environment, and what are the applications of AI that can advance resilience to climate and environmental change and advance sustainable development. And so I'm happy to talk a little bit as an AI user, but also as this outside environmental perspective.
I am Anna Marasovic. I'm an assistant professor at Kalhert School of Computing. Before that, I was at Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence. So I am mostly focused on developing and evaluating large language models that are then used in applications we have just heard about.
All right, thank you. So like in the previous panel, the plan is that I have a collection of questions that I will ask of the panelists. We won't necessarily ask every question to all panelists. I'll try to move through these in a way that is engaging, and also there may be questions that come up. We will try to leave enough time for you all to ask questions. What we've noticed on the topic of AI, and we saw this in the last panels, is that if we open up things to you, there will be lots of questions. And we'll try to get to some of those. But let me start with Bill. And since he mentioned that he has at least two hats, one is as a user of AI and one as a member of the Wilkes Institute and Biological Sciences. So what do you feel to be the kind of characterize the impact of AI as you've seen it currently, and then any kind of prognostications in terms of how you see it might go in the future?
Yeah, this is a really fast-moving space, and I think there's a lot that we don't know currently. Actually, there was an article just out in Nature this morning thinking about the intersection of climate and AI. What do we know and what do we not know? And I think what we know now, so some of the knowns are AI absolutely has carbon, energy, water impacts. Those are probably not terribly large now, but are projected to grow very rapidly. So, thinking about that piece and how can we mitigate that and try to minimize those impacts. I think a lot of the unknowns are kind of on the indirect side. So what are the potential risks or consequences of AI to things down the road, things like misinformation and our ability to tackle environmental problems, supply chains. There's a lot of complexity that we don't know. The flip side of that is there are going to be plenty of environmental challenges where we think AI can actually accelerate the science and accelerate the solutions. And so how can we find what those are, whether it's things like wildfire detection, maybe agricultural monitoring and detecting when crops are stressed and we can optimize irrigation, optimize power grids. Can we use AI for saving energy and really accelerating the energy transition to clean energy? I think there's a lot of opportunities there. What I would say is this is an area where we need kind of a whole of society approach, and we absolutely need academics and this interdisciplinary engagement from people all across different disciplines, not just the people who use AI or build AI, but the humanities, the social sciences, the health sciences. That's how we're going to really get our hands on what are the risks and how can we minimize them and what are the opportunities. I like to think that AI is this incredibly good hammer, and we want to know what the nails are, but we also want to know what the glass windows are, because we don't want to swing the hammer at everything and find out later what were glass windows, what were nails, and maybe what were screws, and it didn't help much at all.
Thank you. So and I want to follow up on his question. So as an AI developer, and so being within the field, but within the AI field, some of the things that Bill mentioned were, for instance, energy consumption. Is this something discussed in terms of not only the AI tools, but the platforms on which they run? And how does that fold into your thinking as an AI developer within your sphere?
So there is some discussion about how much water and other kinds of energy training models require. It is important to also emphasize that there are different kinds of model training. One is training we call pre-training, which happens for a longer period of time, usually months. It takes lots of data, and we are usually increasing the model size. And this is where the biggest consumption of energy happens. Then the benefit of having pre-training is that a lot of us can reuse this model and change it just so slightly, train it with a way shorter period of time to get whatever application we have in mind. And I think this is where kind of how scary energy consumption is unclear to a lot of people who develop models like large language models like me. I personally do not pre-train models because I don't have power to do that. That's something that happens in a few big corporations. So I feel like a lot of us who are using these tools, we feel like, okay, we are not really making a big impact on the environment. But then there is, of course, question as things scale, how much collectively do we actually impact the environment? Most recently, newest open source large language model that has been released by Meta, Llama 3, has shared the amount of water consumption they use. And although, unfortunately, I don't have the quantity from the top of my head, it was something that kind of makes you think. So definitely something to have in mind, but how to have these useful models without doing this very intense pre-training stage is a technical question that's completely unanswered right now. We don't have other recipe for producing these kinds of powerful systems.
So, Margaret, I'll ask you, but slightly differently, which is this has been one concern, which would be energy, but how within your sphere, relative to the state, not necessarily where would they rank that, but what's the most important AI issues? And it may not be that, it may be something else that you want to elevate with the discussion here.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I would sort of divide the answer to that question in a couple of ways. One is just that state itself, the state operations, the government, and we actually have a whole division of technology services that is sort of grappling with for the state, that is grappling with how AI should and shouldn't be used by state agencies. There was a law passed just this past legislative session a couple of months ago around how sort of the data privacy for citizens done at the state level. But I think, and so that was done with kind of the lens of artificial intelligence and how the state might use or not use it. But I think more broadly, if you think about the inputs, as I understand it, to creating these large language models, it's energy and it's data, and it's our data, and it's our information. And so there's obviously the copyright issues that folks have seen arise, but I think it's more importantly and more fundamentally, one of the things we're thinking about is what does it mean for our personhood to have all of our nuanced behavior that is collected by these large tech companies, and they have been collecting it, now put into models and being potentially, used to manipulate us and nudge us along in ways that we may not realize, and that can take away our free will. And so that's, I think, the larger issue that we're thinking about when we think not so much within state government, but for the citizens, right, of Utah and beyond.
Maybe pivoting from that, but going back to Anna. So I think Margaret brought up an interesting partition, which was energy and data. So there are at least two parts. And maybe energy is within infrastructure. So there's infrastructure and data. Is there anything else you would add to that in terms of things that we need to be thinking of, or the audience needs to be thinking of when they think of AI in terms of tool development and deployment?
I feel the answer is definitely yes, but at the same time, like, what are the other things? Data is by far one of the most important things that drives these systems, right? This is where the models learn everything they can do. But there are different kinds of data. I mentioned this pre-training stage, and this is where the data that's usually being just scraped from the internet, and whatever is on the internet, it has been used for training these models. And of course, the question of copyright then comes into the play there. But then there is a second stage of training, which is super important for having systems like ChatGPT, which is human labeled data, where annotators, contractors are asked, given two outputs, which one do you prefer? And this modeling of preferences has been extremely important for having this new wave of artificial intelligence that happened in the late 2023. So the kinds of data we have are different, and the, for example, question of copyright is not a question we should be asking about preference data, because those people were paid to do this, to do this data annotation. I have lots to say about the copyright, but I don't want to derail the whole discussion about that, because it's a complicated question. I feel on the surface levels, it always seems like, yeah, if someone has data, don't use it. But then there is a whole fair use argument, and who has the most money can buy the licenses. So you are kind of preventing open source. So the discussion about that is a little bit complex. So yeah, there is data. There is energy we mentioned, but in a little bit, I would say, vague way. We say computational budget, which is often determined by the number of GPUs one has and type of GPUs one has. And of course, that's the type of GPUs now mostly are coming from NVIDIA, and hopefully there will be some competitors in the future. So that also is determining maybe the success of your AI if you now switch from NVIDIA's hardware to something else. So yeah, we talked about hardware, data, and so far we all have defaulted to a single architecture type, a neural architecture type, so there isn't much diversity over there. But then maybe in the future, that's going to be also something, people will be exploring. And yeah, I think that's what comes to mind.
Okay. So, I mean, playing off of that, and a question to you, Bill, and now drawing on your expertise as a scientist. So now I want you to leverage that for this question. And setting aside data privacy for this discussion, meaning we acknowledge that. What are the other things we should be aware of? So as a scientist, and you're thinking through data, and things that you would either warn us or encourage us, because as a scientist, you've had to deal with these types of questions relative to scientific process. What would be your warning to us in terms of responsible data use, collection, the things to be mindful of as we move forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it is going to be somewhat context dependent on what are you trying to do with the AI model, and what is your input data and what are your algorithms or models that you're looking at. Thinking from the kind of climate environment perspective, you want to think a little bit about what are the training data going in, and particularly when there are people involved, there may be biases in those data going in, that you may have underreporting in certain of environmental challenges in certain regions, under monitoring. We don't monitor things like air quality in marginalized communities nearly as much as we do. So understanding what the kind of broad scale infrastructure and potential inputs to your data are, and potential patterns and biases from those, I think are important. I think there's a question of, are these the right data that we can use for this problem? And that's, I'll take wildfire as an example there, right? Is that if we wanted to think about wildfire models and training wildfire models, it actually depends a lot on whether you're trying to model things like firefighter safety, when fires really go nonlinear and spread rapidly, smoke plumes for the health consequences downwind, or the kind of heat of the wildfire that determines how much carbon is burned and shot up to the atmosphere. And so, thinking about what are the right tools, and maybe just to take a step back, is this an AI problem to begin with? I think our default shouldn't necessarily be to turn to the biggest model possible. I think our default should be, as we do as scientists all the time, to think about what's the right tool for this, and is this an AI problem? It's not clear that solving air quality is an AI problem. I think it's more of a policy and societal problem, but maybe AI can help in terms of extrapolating patterns and finding patterns and improving some of our weather models to simulate air quality. So that step back and asking to begin with, is this an AI problem, I think is an important one.
Okay, so now switching gears slightly, the purpose of the panel is responsible AI, so I'll pivot to Margaret. And you don't need to necessarily represent the state, but I would say represent the citizens of the state. When they hear responsible as a label used for AI, what do you anticipate them thinking about when that's said? And then you could say how the state is starting to think about that, appreciating that they represent our citizenry. So what is responsible or responsibility when we talk about AI?
I think it's probably you could probably divide it into two sets. And one is, what are we trying to use the technology for? What problems are we trying to solve with the technology, right? And you've pointed out a fantastic one, right? In terms of, helping to simulate wildfires so that we can better understand how to control them. That's a great example of something that will benefit everyone as a citizenry. I think areas in health and education, those are fundamental parts of our lives that the government is involved in serving its citizens. And so understanding how we can deploy health and education in more efficient and effective ways will be really, really important. And that is, when we're looking at how do we deploy AI in the most responsible way, it's focusing on the problems that affect us. So I think that's the first kind. The second is, how do we do it responsibly? So one is sort of the topics that you focus on, and one is how you do it. And I think that's what we're really trying to grapple with. And again, I mentioned the data issue. How do we do it in a way that is not causing us all to be essentially robots of some of these big LLMs, because they have the data and they have our information, and now it can be operationalized in a way that is orders of magnitude more than what can happen now. And so I think that's where we think about regulation. And do you want me to talk about what we're kind of doing right now in Utah?
Go ahead and mention it.
So let me tell you what we've done so far. So myself and some others, a couple of legislators, Representative Jefferson Moss and Senator Kirk Collimore, and then a couple of industry folks got together around a year ago to start figuring out how do we get our arms around this? What should we be doing as a state? And the great thing about Utah is that when we set our mind to something, we can get it done. We don't have the sort of quagmire that happens in Washington, where nothing can really happen. And so we set forth to figure out what the right approach was. And after getting hearing a lot of input from experts from all over the country and even the world, and right here in Utah, we have so many amazing people in the industry now here in Utah. And my colleague Greg Wisnet out here was instrumental in helping with this project as well. But we ended up coming up with an approach for the state of Utah that was adopted into Senate Bill 149 in past legislative session. And it does a couple of things. One, it puts some light regulation on a consumer-facing piece of AI, which would be like text bots, chat bots, those kinds of things that interact with consumers. And basically just says you have to have disclose if you're a text bot, not you, the AI, if you have a company that has a text bot or a chat bot and it's interacting with a customer or a consumer, and that consumer wants to know whether or not it's human or not, it has to answer honestly. We played around, but you can easily program your AI to not answer honestly. And then more importantly, for sensitive interactions, you have to disclose that up front. So for things like something, if a mental health therapist is using this, or a financial advisor is using this, or a doctor is using this, they would have to disclose up front that it is a non-human interaction. The second part of the law, which is really exciting, is we set up an AI policy lab, which will basically have a couple of different roles. The first will be to have this proactive learning agenda, which will look at what is the most current thing that we need to look at right now based on where we are with AI, because we know things are changing very quickly, and spin up a set of recommendations based on interacting with businesses, with stakeholders, with experts, but recommendations to the legislature. The second part will be regulatory mitigation that can be offered to companies that are working in this AI space to help to lessen regulatory risk. So that's how Utah has decided to approach it for now, really looking at the sort of three objectives, which is to encourage innovation, protect the public, and have an active place to observe and learn. So I'll stop there.
No, I think that's helpful because I think it lines us up for another set of questions. And I'll set the frame, and I think I'll ask you, Anna, and then ask you, Bill. So I think the framing would be that responsible AI, I think Margaret has helped sharpen to, it could be the responsible development of, so responsible here is relative to those developing, it's responsible relative to those using, and then there's responsible relative to those deploying. And I'm distinguishing those two. I think she talked about deployment. So maybe now I will pitch it to, say, Anna, as an educator, how do we encourage those that are developing AI in terms of the principles of responsible? And then I'll go to Bill right after that, which will be for those using. Again, how do we help train as educators? How do we train those using? So Anna.
Yeah, that's a great question. Just last week in my class, my students were trying to break large language models and find the failure modes, just as an example. But yeah, I think to answer this question, I also need to give a context of what responsible AI means in my community, which is, as AI is evolving, the idea of what responsible AI is quickly evolving and changing. But so it's kind of like a confluence of ideas and trends. And depending on about what kind of scholarly work and what kind of discussions you have in mind, the ideas will be quite different. And before, ChatGPT discussions were mostly about societal biases and the fact that these models, regardless of what let's say if the data represents women 3 times less than men, the model will start representing women even less than the rate that was originally in the training data, which is known as to be like amplifying societal biases. So that was for a while a big discussion, and then discussion was also about misinformation and how to prevent these models from persuading us to give money or believe in falsehoods. And there, we had set of techniques, and of course, part of when we teach NLP or machine learning is to teach techniques to quantify how much the model amplifies biases, and to teach about human-centered computing and how to think about, okay, people are going to be using these tools and how they can deem these tools to be something more than they are. But now the discussion has also shifted to something that's more kind of oriented to foreseeable risk or even catastrophic risk, which are in a farther future, such as things as, okay, the models might self-proliferate. They might now, because they are connected to the internet, they might install another model through a command line. Then this model can do certain things for them. They can have a virtual wallet, buy Bitcoins, buy a Google Cloud instance, train another model, and so on. The ideas get a little bit more and more vague and futuristic as we talk about them. And then there is another challenge, which is now at the center of the biggest labs, such as OpenAI, the ideas that the models will become better at us, at everything we do, and how do we still supervise them? How do we still have these way more capable models as tools rather than other way around? This is called scalable oversight, and there is not much information about how to do that. So for me, going back to your question about education, I think there are a bunch of these current challenges with AI, and it's important to teach students concrete tools for evaluation, how to quantify these things, and we have those measures, so they need to know about robustness and things like that. But then it's important also to talk about this, challenges that are way ahead of us, because the ideas are that we should have some thoughts about how to prevent those potential circumstances. We should be thinking about them right now, such that we have something in place if that happens in the future. And that's more oriented toward grad level courses and having discussions, because there aren't concrete tools I can teach them yet.
So I think, Bill, I'd ask the same thing of you, but from the vantage point of AI users. And then I would also inject, since you had mentioned it, how do you encourage your students or those with whom you interact to choose their tools wisely? Because I think, as you kind of alluded to in one part and then actually said in another part, sometimes they actively just start using it because it's the next coolest thing to do. And so as part of responsibility, responsible use of tools and responsible choice of tools.
Yeah, I guess, I maybe want to echo what Anna was saying. I do think this is a fundamental role for a university and for education broadly, right? That we want an AI literate citizenry and an AI literate workforce to understand what are the uses, what are the misuses, and what are the dangers of AI. That's what I think we need to educate our students in our classes, educate the public as we talk to them. This is something where researchers from disciplines across the university who are thinking about AI have to be engaged. And I think that's one of the things that I'm very excited about this responsible AI initiative at the University of Utah is it's really trying to bring together those folks to do this across research, across healthcare, and across education. Coming to the kind of research side and how I think about it with my own students or postdocs, graduate students, to some degree, we care in certain problems a lot about the mechanism and about transparency in the model. And understanding what the model is doing and why it's telling you that answer is often incredibly important. And those are probably not good AI questions. You don't really want to throw a big black box model at it and not understand what comes out of it. There are certain classes of problems where looking at a lot of data and extracting the patterns and seeing what are the big things that rise to the top, where a lot of AI models could be quite helpful. We think about this a lot in terms of satellite data and in terms of climate data, that we have, huge amounts of weather data and long-term climate data that then maybe AI can be useful in certain contexts. I think it's like we do with a lot of our research, let's figure out the question as precisely as we can, find the best set of tools, and then continually look at that and ask, well, did this make sense to use this set of tools. Let's consider a different set if it's not making sense.
So Margaret, maybe I'll ask it differently, but I want to ask an educational question, which is, I think you've heard how from the development of AI, how that's viewed. So Anna's talking about effectively undergraduates, graduates, and Bill's talking about how we're efforting towards that, again, undergraduates and graduates. So you're working in a sphere for which you have people within the state of Utah, your employees, for instance, those representing us, engaging with these new tools. And so how is the state thinking about education relative to your workforce? Because I think a lot of this is happening, as Bill said earlier, at a rapid rate, and you're having to get them up to speed and also have them engaging on our behalf in the state. So how's the state thinking about kind of education within your workforce, within your personnel?
It's a really important question, and I'll just echo what you just said, Bill, about, all of us have to, it's almost like incumbent upon us to learn and to educate ourselves about these tools. And as I said, the state's Division of Technology Services they've already put out some things about things that you should not do, in terms of putting in any kind of PII or anything like that, if you're using the tools. I know they're working on a document or a set of strategies of how it can be deployed. But I'll tell you, in our department, there's a couple of different things. We actually have some in-house talent that is helping us to think about how we can use tools in our department, and just generally, how do we even make sense of this new technology? So we've done some education in-house on that. But there's some really exciting things that I would love to use AI for in our department and our work that I think would absolutely benefit the public. And I'll give you an example. So one of the things we do at our department is we do most of the professional licensing for the state of Utah. So we have about 400,000 people in the state of Utah, which is a large chunk of Utah's workforce that has to get their professional license with our department. So some of you might have heard of Division of Professional Licensing, or DOPL, or the Division of Securities, or the Division of Real Estate. All of these issue different kinds of licenses: doctors, nurses, real estate agents, securities professionals, and the list goes on. One of the problems we have is when people come in to our state from having been trained in one of these professions from a foreign country. Maybe they're engineers, or they're doctors, or they're nurses, or whatever. And we don't really have a great way to get them licensed here. And so they end up working far below their skill set and their training. Meanwhile, we have workforce shortages. So it's a really inefficient scheme. So we've, in the last couple of years, worked on legislation to give us authority to create pathways for these folks. The problem is it actually is hard to do, because we have to take what we know of wherever they got their training, whether it was India, whether it was Nepal, whether it was, China, whether it was Argentina, wherever. And those are all very different. And compared to what we require here in Utah, the requirements for that license here, and then what is the delta? So that's painstaking work, because you can imagine all the different permutations, all the different countries for all the different 100 different profession types. So it's a massive amount of work, but you can imagine if we could apply that to compare the jurisdiction's requirements, it would immensely make our lives easier and help us license and get people into the workforce faster. So if anyone wants a business idea, there you go. But that's an example of how we're trying to figure out how we could use it to benefit the work that we do that ultimately benefits the citizens here in Utah.
I think that's a plug for any of you who actually are looking for employment. There's also opportunities within the state of Utah. So maybe I'll stay with Margaret, and we'll transition to something we were discussing as a group when we met, which is unforeseen consequences. So I think there's cases for which we anticipate positive usages, and there's cases for which, under responsible AI, we imagine that there are cases where you would not use AI, but we're in this place for which there's unforeseen consequences. So have examples come up in your work or within your sphere where you could help, for instance, the audience appreciate where even good intentions were met with things that were unforeseen and that highlight something that we should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say anything has happened yet within state government, because state government, we're slow. We're slow on the uptake on a lot of these things. And it's done partly out of caution, right? We really want to understand because we can't risk, our risk of violating, our citizens' trust is just huge. But you can imagine all sorts of things going wrong with the hallucination risk. If we're trying to help a citizen, I know one of the things that the state is looking at is using more of these chat bots for customer service purposes. You can imagine a situation where it makes something up, the chat bot does, and really redirects a citizen that could have really kind of bad consequences. Maybe it has something to do with their taxes, or maybe it has something to do with their professional license, and now they're not licensed, and they have consequences for that. So there's, because we have the authority of the state, we have to be extra cautious about how we're deploying tools to help our citizens, because the risk of getting it wrong is high, and it has real consequences for our citizens. So we're cautious right now.
I think we're all thankful for that. I think Anna, now pivoting, but the same idea, but to you, I think you mentioned failure modes as an example. So where would unforeseen consequences, failure modes show up in your
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are many of them, because otherwise I wouldn't have a job and I could go home. I would say actually maybe the biggest unforeseeable thing for me and a lot of people I know was that we have made so many advances in areas of creative art and programming. When you ask people years ago, what do you think will be the first jobs that might be replaced by AI? Those jobs were always at the top of the list of, no, this is the, sacred jobs that will never be, replaceable by AI. And this is because no one really, except people who then build the technology, understood that how powerful the data, the internet data is, how vast it is, and how scaling of the model size and the data can be a successful approach. I mean, one company, OpenAI, made that bet, and then they succeeded, right? So because the data comes from these sources, which are GitHub, and people putting their own art, their own essays, their own visualizations on the internet, this is where we made the first hit. And this was really unexpected, I would say. I mean, I haven't met the person who said that that's going to be the first thing that will go away. So anything that's more physical, like being a plumber or working in construction, that's a secure job right now. And I don't see, that is going to be replaceable quite soon. So yeah, that was something that was really unforeseeable. And in terms of the other failure mode, yeah, I mean, there are obvious things like these tools are trying to be too much, I would say. They are too general purpose. So, for example, the issue of hallucinations was mentioned. If you want to do your taxes and if the number is made up, that's a problem, right? If you are using the tool for creative writing, you want it to make things up because that helps you, spur your creativity. So for me, lots of these failure modes around factuality, hallucinations come from the fact that we are just using ChatGPT off shelf, and we are not specializing it in a way that we can actually. But it's so much easier to just prompt model rather than have a whole programming code to change its parameters and train it. That requires actually having education in this space, right? Like our students, we teach them how to train models, and that's something that is not so easy to learn as prompting is. So I feel like we already have certain techniques for figuring out how to have better applications, such as helping, for example, with access, although still not perfect. But yeah, it's not as easy as just using things off shelf, and brings us back to the fact that we need to educate people, right? I feel like everyone now defaults to using ChatGPT, but there are so many other options, and yeah, they just might not be aware of them. Yeah, there's a lot to say, but I'll stop here.
So I think, Bill, slightly different question, but since they've introduced this idea of kind of, I'll say, conservative and then more creative as an axis, and where do you think in terms of use of AI tools within environmental studies, given that is a topic that within our state and region is very important for various reasons. You know, where do you think that where AI sits there, and how do you encourage your students in terms of its use on that axis?
Yeah,
I know I gave you a lot of liberty in that one, so that, you know, that's very broad. But and you can sharpen the question, but I think I just want to see, because I think on the government side, right, being conservative is very important. Would you, within environment, you know, to sharpen it, for instance, within environmental sciences, would you say use traditional tools for almost all your public? And then on the side, if you want to use AI, that's fine in terms of icing. Or are you starting to move towards those being the principal tools you're using for some of your work broadly?
Sure, I would say it's certainly rapidly evolving. And, you know, as scientists, we're kind of excited to tinker and try new tools, try new models, see what you learn from different tools and different models. And so a large number of my colleagues and students are, I would say, experimenting with different AI models and tools. It's definitely not the bulk of folks that of papers I read and folks that I work with right now. I think it's, you know, it's probably growing as a fraction, but it's a much smaller fraction. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I don't know what that ultimate kind of number might be. I did want to come back to this kind of unforeseen consequences because as, you know, thinking about climate change day to day, and we try to look out 100 years and look at what are some of the, you know, things we can foresee and model and some of the unforeseen consequences. To me, there's always going to be things you don't see coming. And I think some of our first run-in with AI through social media and all the consequences that's had for mental health and polarization and things like that, we may not have seen that coming 15, 20 years ago. I think it's important at this point, seeing how fast things are changing, to build the structures to be proactive and I guess kind of detecting when problems might arise. And this really comes to having some guardrails, thinking about policy and regulation, but it also really comes to having so many people at the table who are looking at these same models and asking, how can you break this? What are the risks for this sector? If I put this model in a healthcare challenge, what could go wrong? You know, what are the potential biases in this model? That we really need that everyone at the table. And it comes to also this fundamental piece of transparency that this is, I think, a key role that universities have to play, is that if the development is happening at universities, we have a lot of that open transparency. And if it's happening at private companies, we may not have that. And so the transparency of algorithms and training data sets has to be a key part in detecting what could go wrong and what are the foreseen and unforeseen consequences. So that's, you know, I kind of come back to this. It really takes this broad community and this kind of partnership between universities, government, and the private sector to innovate, but to do so in a way that we don't break those glass windows and try to avoid, you know, jumping through them when they are getting broken.
So I'll ask one more question of Margaret, and then we'll open it up to the audience. But I think continuing on that, you, if I recall earlier, you mentioned the state's interest in a sandbox. And so I think if you could speak to that now, kind of leveraging off of what Bill said, which is a sandbox. I think the way, at least academically, we think of a sandbox is it's a place that is controlled enough in terms of safety, but realistic enough that hopefully you can see some of these unforeseen consequences. So it's a playground, but not the playground of the public without guardrails. And so how's the state thinking about it? And what are the first steps you think the state is planning to do in terms of playing in that sandbox for the good of our citizens?
Yeah, and first let me just react to Bill's comment, because I love his hammer nail glass windows metaphor. He said that in the pre-panel meeting, and I can't stop thinking about it because I think it's so good. But a lot of it has to do with how do we maintain and even build trust? Because we are in a society right now that has very little trust. We don't trust our government institutions. It's something that Governor Cox talks about all the time. We don't trust a lot of companies now because we've seen what big tech, you know, in many ways has done that has not been trustworthy. And we don't trust each other. We have political polarization. And so one of the things that was very heartening to me when we did these focus groups with all these different AI tech business, leaders, was that they were very interested in wanting to develop trust with their customers. They didn't want AI to be something that broke the trust. And I thought that was heartening, actually. And so when you talk about having public, private, academia coming together, I think that's so important. And we're the humans that have to do it, because the machines aren't going to do it, right? We are the humans that have to do it, that have to have our eyes on it. And so that's why I love what the university's doing, what Manish and the leadership there is going to be incredibly important. Let me talk about the sandbox for a minute. So I mentioned there were sort of two parts to this AI policy lab that we've created. Going to be housed within the Department of Commerce. We just hired our director. He's starting on Monday. He's actually from BYU, sorry, but he's an AI researcher and mathematics professor at from BYU. And so that one part I talked about, that having a learning agenda, that's one piece of it that will be making constant recommendations on policy to the legislature so we can have our eyes on what's going on. And have that agility. The second part is the regulatory mitigation. We're not calling it exactly a sandbox, because sometimes with a sandbox, a regulatory sandbox, that implies a full exemption from laws. And that may happen, but we call it more regulatory mitigation because there are some laws that we would never exempt a company from, certain, like a consumer protection law. We're just not going to exempt a company from. But what we could do is, a company could come to this lab and say, this is what we want to do. And then the lab would help to work with the relevant regulator. So say it's in the realm of consumer protection. And it could come and say, we want to do this in a controlled way. We're going to look at it. We're going to make sure we're nervous because of the hallucinatory effects that our chatbot might have with our customers. Greg and I would often use the example of an airline that maybe has a chatbot that's helping people book their itineraries, that hallucinates, it makes up an itinerary. You've got somebody going to the airport and now the guy can't go to his brother's wedding, right? So that could happen. So if that were in this regulatory mitigation piece and they had some agreements, then maybe our Division of Consumer Protection might say, you're still going to have to make the consumer whole, but we'll maybe agree to have up front, we'll agree to cap penalties, or we're going to agree to a 30-day curing period if something happens like that, where you have to just fix the problem. And so, but there might be laws that we would exempt from as well, just depending on the situation. But the idea is to help to stimulate innovation, help to de-risk or lessen risk, both for the company and for investors that might want to or would be investors, because there's a lot of worry and concern there as well. But it's designed to help Utah, right? And be a place for innovation, because a lot of these companies, they see regulatory actions as the cost of doing business, and they have armies of lawyers and they're not really worried about it because they're big enough. But startup companies, smaller companies trying to gain a foothold, that's where we want to help. So that's kind of how it's going to work. We'll see. We have a lot to do to get it going and figure out the details, but that's the basic idea.
Okay. Well, I think we will open it up to questions from the audience. We have about 10 minutes. Please go to the microphone so that online they can hear you. When you ask a question, you can ask it of a particular panelist if there's a context, or if it's general, I will possibly choose one to answer it. Go ahead.
Anna, you mentioned that Meta open sourced their latest large language model, Llama 3, and it seems like there are clear risks and benefits to open sourcing. Democratization of access versus giving a leg up to bad actors. I wonder if you could discuss pros and cons of open source.
Yeah, of course. Obviously, dual use is a massive issue, right? We can use large language models for, again, any kind of writing. A lot of emails today seem to be written by these things, but you can use it also to write phishing emails. And the model has no idea about your intentions, right? You prompt it to write you an email, and it has no idea whether this is meant for actually informing someone or fooling someone. So this is part of the problem of larger ML systems. And I think a lot of discussions right now are about particular models, as if the model is to blame, where in all of these misuse cases, it's not the model that's doing anything, rather the whole system where the model is deployed, there isn't a good defense, both technical and also, regulation often is behind. And then, I mean, of course, if there is no compliance, nothing is changing. However, looking back at the history, people will commonly use this kind of misuse example to say, well, open source therefore shouldn't, we shouldn't have open source models. When in the history we had seen that if we have open source tools, collectively we do so much more to make this whole system more robust and therefore have better technology. So looking back at the history, I think we have a good argument that by releasing these things, the whole system will become more robust. And again, the fact that your model is closed doesn't mean it's safe. There is this idea of prompt injection where we found through optimization a sequence of characters that are not, you can't, they don't have semantic meaning, that you can add to the end of your prompt, and then the model will start, closed source model will start producing information that it shouldn't produce, such as assisting people with using nuclear, biochemical materials, which we do not want. And these prompts that we add to the end of your original prompt are, again, you can use open source system to do the optimization. You find something that works for your open source system, and then you use it for the closed source system. So we repeatedly see that you can break ChatGPT despite it being a closed model. So given the benefits we have seen from history, I would say I'm very much so on board with open sourcing. But I also want to emphasize that there is a gradient. People often talk about this in binaries, like it must be completely open source or completely closed. Meta had produced this amazing tool called Segment Anything, where given any kind of image, you can find objects and people on the image, which immediately surveillance comes to mind. Like now you can surveil everything. And they didn't release it immediately because of this, they wanted to have a discussion with the community about how should this be open source? And then eventually, gradually, they released weaker versions of this. So yeah, I think this gradient makes sense, right? Like it doesn't have to be completely open sourced or completely closed sourced. But going back to what was said about we need transparency, right? If everything is closed, you don't have any transparency and you have no idea scientifically what's important for these tools. So again, another disadvantage of not having any open source systems. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is a question for Anna as well. Just a quick question. So it goes back to the question of trust and trusting what the AI is telling us. So when do you think it will be possible that the AIs will actually give us like confidence intervals or error bars in the answers that they give us instead of just the answer?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is yeah, my community is a little bit funky like that. We don't have any guarantees, right, of anything. There are no principles almost. It's engineering. And these days there is even a funkier idea to just ask a model how confident it is and then translate whatever number you get into high, medium, low, which I think you are terrified as I just say this. Luckily, there are researchers who are trying to bridge more principled approaches, especially in a clinical domain, with these large language models that are not principled in any way, and then get something that is more like a confidence intervals. I think this is very much still an open-ended research, and I hate giving any kind of predictions in years because
3 years. That's right.
I think Anna did a great job because I thought she was going to answer that as soon as we can get humans to give confidence intervals when they.
Exactly.
Yes, I thought you were going to pull that one. I think we'll have time for one more question. Oh,
Okay, I'll try to make it a good one.
Okay.
So I think about responsible AI in the context that I work is in education, right? Because I'm trying to think about how do I introduce it to students because they're going to be expected to know how to use these tools. And I'm trying to figure out a way to make sure that you're using them responsibly, but reasonably, but not skimping out on work, but not missing the experience. And so I wonder, especially from your perspectives as educators who work with students and in this AI space, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Because we don't, ChatGPT can and Copilot and some of these things can do a decent job of writing a lot of code for you, but then do your students miss out on the opportunity of learning that code? And same thing for writing, and same thing for a lot of the processes that we've, traditionally been taught that you need to do manually.
Bill, maybe I'll let you take that one.
Sure. I mean, briefly, I have a number of colleagues who, and students are aware of these and are in many cases using these tools extensively. And so I think actually a number of colleagues, and I started to roll this out slowly in some of my own courses, just have a very clear, direct discussion at the outset of the course and talk about what are the potential scenarios in which you could see using an LLM? What are the downsides of that or the risks of that? And some of those could be, if you use an LLM to do all your coding, you don't learn as nearly as well to code yourself, and you go get a job, and then you can't actually do some of that creative coding that you need to, that the LLM can't do. So, think through the downsides, including, their environmental impacts. We worry about biases and things like that. So there's social impacts as well, labor as well. So just have that frank discussion and then agree as a class that we think, these are the scenarios in which this could be an acceptable use. And some assignments will say, maybe use ChatGPT for this and then interpret and give feedback on what ChatGPT wrote. And that we think these are not the okay uses for it. And it's, of course, really hard to detect and kind of enforce that, but really having that frank discussion of there are upsides, but there are also risks and downsides. This is, as a society, we've got to think through it. Let's start thinking through it now as students in this class.
All right, well, I think I'll apologize. We don't have any time for any more questions, but if we would thank our panelists, I think this has been great.